Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm Leonie and today I'm showing you how to sew the Alex jacket. This is also the Alex jacket. In this video I'm sewing this version, almost the same. It just has one button and the collar is a little more low and the final pattern is a little higher. This one is a little shorter. So keep in mind you can always adjust the length on the sleeves or on the hem and make it yours. It's nice that the collar is directly connected with the main piece, so we don't need any extra pattern pieces. Let me know if you have any questions. I always try to answer as quickly as possible. Have fun sewing and tag me if you post any pictures. I always love to see your makes. Make sure to subscribe. Let's begin.
Before we get started, I always recommend reading through the manual first. There you'll find an overview of all pattern pieces, fabric requirements for your size, and some general sewing notes. For my version, I'm using a medium to heavy wool boucle fabric. You can choose something similar or go for a lighter fabric if you want a softer look. I'm adding 4 buttons to the front, but of course you can adjust that to your own preference. For example, my first version only had 1 button. You'll also need some interfacing tape for the edges. This helps to prevent the fabric from stretching out while you sew. And optionally, but highly recommended, use fusible interfacing for the facing pieces. It gives the jacket a bit more structure and helps the neckline to sit nicely. Here are all the pattern pieces already cut out. Before we start sewing, transfer all the notches carefully, especially around the armholes and sleeve caps. If your fabric looks very similar on both sides, make sure to mark the wrong side so you don't get confused later. Now I'm marking the placement for the buttonholes and the patch pockets. I like to use a simple thread tracing method for that. I take a needle and thread, push the needle straight through the paper and fabric at each marking, leaving a few centimeters of thread on both sides. Once all points are marked, I gently remove the paper and the thread stays in place on both fabric layers, showing the markings clearly. Of course, you can also mark these points using tailor's chalk or pins if you prefer. Next, I'm stabilizing the shoulder seams and the neckline on the back piece using fusible tape. It's important to do that on the left side of the fabric, and we do that for both back pieces. I recommend placing a sheet of baking paper in between the iron and the fabric to protect your iron. Mine doesn't stick, so I don't need it, but usually it's recommended. Before applying the fusible interfacing for the facing, always test it on a small fabric swatch first to make sure it works well with your fabric. Here you can already see the difference. The interfaced fabric has more structure. Cut out the fusible interfacing pieces using the facing pattern as a guide. You'll need 2 mirrored pieces, one for each side. Cut them slightly smaller than the facing itself so the glue doesn't extend past the edges when pressing. Then press the interfacing to the wrong side of the facing pieces. The jacket is not lined, so we need to finish all the open edges. You can use an overlock machine or a zigzag stitch on your normal sewing machine. In the manual you can see which edges need to be finished. Now coming to the patch pockets. First we press the side edges and the bottom edge of each pocket about 1/2 centimeter, 1/4 inch, to the wrong side. Then press the top edge down by 2 centimeters, about 3/4 of an inch. My fabric doesn't hold the fold very well, so I'm using plenty of pins to keep it in place. And then we sew along the top edge with a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, about 1/2 inch, to secure the fold. This gives the pocket opening a nice clean finish. Next, repeat everything for the second pocket. Now let's sew the pocket flaps. Place both flap pieces right sides together and stitch all around with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, leaving the top edge open. When you get to the corners, you can stop with the needles in the fabric, lift the presser foot, and pivot the fabric all around. This way you get clean corners. Trim the corners carefully to reduce bulk, then turn the flap right side out through the opening. Press it flat and use a pointed turner or a pin to gently shape the corners. Top stitch all the way around, about 1 presser foot width from the edge for a clean and professional look. Now position the pockets on the markings of both front pieces. Place them right side up on the right side of the fabric and align them carefully so they're perfectly straight. Make sure the pressed seam allowance stay neatly tucked underneath. Pin the pockets in place. The more pins, the better, especially if your fabric is thick or tends to shift. Then sew the pockets on. Start at one of the top corners, sew down to the side, across the bottom and back to the other side. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and end to secure the seams. This helps to prevent the corners from coming loose over time. Next, take the pocket flap and position it about 1 centimeter above the pocket opening, parallel to the top edge. Pin it in place and stitch straight across about 1 presser foot's width from the edge. Then fold the flap down over the pocket and press it flat. Top stitch again along the upper edge of the flap to secure the seam allowance underneath. Now take both back pieces and place them right sides together. Sew along the center back seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam open. You can optionally add a row of top stitching on both sides of the seam from the right side. I personally like this look. It gives the jacket a more structured and high quality finish, and it helps to secure the seam allowance. Now we take all sleeve pieces. Each sleeve consists of 2 parts, so make sure they are mirrored and aligned correctly before sewing. Place the matching pieces right sides together and sew along the outer edge with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Press the seam open and again you can top stitch along both sides if you like the look. Here I added 1 line of top stitching along the smaller sleeve section. It gives a nice detail and reinforces the seam. Now move on to the front pieces. Place the 2 front pieces right sides together and sew the center back seam. That's the seam that connects the collar area at the top. Press the seam open and just like before, add top stitching along both sides about 1 presser foot away from the seam. Now it's time to attach the back piece to the front pieces. Place one shoulder of the back piece right sides together with the matching shoulder on one of the front pieces. Pin carefully along the shoulder seam. Sew the seam, but stop exactly 1 centimeter before the neckline edge. It helps to mark this intersection point on both pieces beforehand so you know exactly where to stop. This point will later connect the collar curve, so it's important to be precise here. Backstitch at the end to secure the seam. Then take the other side of the back piece, place it right sides together with the other front piece and repeat the same steps. Once both shoulders are sewn, you'll see that the neckline and collar area is now open in the middle. Now we can pin along the neckline, starting from one shoulder point where you stopped sewing across the back neckline to the other shoulder point. Make sure the center back seam of the collar matches perfectly with the center back seam of the body. Sew along this curve carefully and backstitch at both ends. After sewing the neckline seam, turn the jacket to the right side and check that everything looks neat and that the points meet cleanly at the corners. You'll see a small triangular shape where the seams intersect, and that's exactly how it should look. Technically, you could sew this section in one continuous line, but I find it much easier and cleaner to do it in two separate steps. Then press all the seam allowances open for a flat and professional finish. I also like to add some top stitching on the shoulder seam. Time to attach the sleeves. I like to use the method where we first sew the sleeve into the armhole and later close the sleeve seam and side seam together in one continuous line. First, I marked all the notches with pins on both the sleeves and the armhole, front and back, to make sure everything lines up correctly. It's important to know that the back piece connects with the side with the seam, so make sure you don't confuse the two sleeves and choose the correct side. Place the sleeve right sides together with the main piece and start pinning carefully, matching all notches and especially the shoulder seam at the top. Distribute the ease evenly around the sleeve cap so there are no puckers. Then sew the sleeve to the armholes, sewing slowly and adjusting the fabric as you go to keep the curve smooth. You can now press the seam allowance. I like to press it gently toward the sleeve to help the armhole curve sit nicely. Next, fold the jacket right sides together so that the front and back pieces align, and fold the sleeve in half as well. Make sure everything lies flat and smooth. Then pin along the side seam and sleeve seams, matching the underarm points carefully so the seams meet neatly. Use plenty of pins to keep everything in place and sew each side in one continuous line, starting from the sleeve hem all the way down to the jacket hem. Sew slowly and carefully around the underarm curve to keep it smooth. Then turn the jacket right side out and check that the underarm seams meet perfectly. Press the seam allowance open. Now we come to the facing. Start by placing both facing pieces right sides together and sew the center back seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Press the seam open. Next, we pin the facing to the jacket all around, right sides together, starting at one front edge along the neckline and down the other front edge. Make sure that everything aligns, especially the center back seams and the corners. Sew around the entire edge with a 1 cm seam allowance from one hem edge up the front around the neckline and down to the other side. Then carefully trim back the seam allowance, especially around the corners and curves, so the edges turn nicely and don't bulk. Now we understitch. Press the facing away from the jacket and sew close to the seam on the facing side, catching the seam allowance underneath. This helps the facing stay neatly inside and prevents it from rolling outward. You might not be able to reach all the way into the corners, that's completely fine. Understitch all along both front edges and the neckline. Now it's time to sew the buttonholes. Yay! Each sewing machine works a little differently, so make sure to check your manual first to understand your machine's buttonhole settings. For example, on my machine there are 4 steps, one to sew down the left side, the second one to sew across the front, third to go back up on the right side, and the fourth to close the end. So before sewing on your actual jacket, always test the size and settings on a scrap of the same fabric. Mark the buttonhole length by measuring your button and adding about 3 millimeters for extra space. Once finished, place a pin across the end of the buttonhole to prevent cutting too far. Carefully open the center using a seam ripper or a small pair of scissors and insert your button to check if it's the right size, not too tight, not too loose. Before sewing the buttonholes, make sure they're placed on the right front side of the jacket when worn. Women's jackets traditionally button left over right, meaning right side overlaps the left when closed. When you're happy with the result, mark the exact positions on your jacket front using the markings we already have and making sure everything is perfectly aligned and straight, then sew all buttonholes the same way. It's truly easier than it looks once you've practiced it once or twice. Before hemming, try the jacket on and check the length. If you like it shorter, keep in mind that the pattern includes a 2 cm seam allowance at the hem. So if you want to shorten it, trim off the extra length evenly or all around, remembering to include that seam allowance. Turn the facing inside out along the hem and pin it right sides together with the jacket hem. Sew along the bottom edge with a 2 cm seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance and clip the corners carefully so they turn out nicely, and then turn around and press the edge. Then press the remaining hem allowance up by 2 cm and pin in place all around. From the right side, stitch with a 1.5 cm distance all around the hem, starting at one center front to the other. Alternatively, you could also hand sew with a blind stitch from the inside if you want an invisible hem. Repeat the same for the sleeves. Try them on, adjust the length if needed, then press up by 2 cm and top stitch neatly all around. Press the facing all around so it sits nicely inside. And to keep the collar facing in place, you can either hand stitch it to the neckline seam on the inside or secure it with a short line of stitching in the ditch from the right side, about 5 centimeters on each side of the center back. Finally, it's time to attach the buttons. Lay the jacket flat, mark the button placement through each hole onto the opposite side using a pin. You can also use chalk or fabric marker and then sew the buttons on by hand. That's it, your Alex jacket is finished. I really hope you enjoyed sewing along with me and that you love how it turned out. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming sewing tutorials and new pattern releases. You can find all links, including the pattern and manual, below in the description. And you can also find me on my other socials, they're all linked there too. I always love seeing your versions of my patterns, so if you share your jacket, tag me so I can see it and maybe repost it. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video.